At 8:15 a.m. on March 28, 1945, inside a cold, mist-laden temporary POW processing camp near Remagen, a strange stillness hung over the rows of khaki tents. The Rhine River, only a few hundred yards away, rolled under a gray sky as if trying to conceal the ruin Germany had become. American MPs moved briskly along the muddy walkway, their boots slapping against wooden planks laid hurriedly the night before. And across from them stood dozens of exhausted women, German support personnel captured during the collapse of the Western Front, still trembling from days of marching, bombardment, and chaos. The air carried the lingering scent of diesel, boiled coffee, and smoke from the burned-out farms behind them. But what none of them expected was the smell drifting from a nearby field kitchen, where large steel pots hissed and bubbled like cauldrons. Its aroma was warm, almost comforting, and strangely foreign to them that a sergeant lifted a ladle, steam rising around his face, and shouted for the next group to step forward. A few of the German women exchanged puzzled glances. Some had braced themselves for punishment or starvation. Rumors had spread in the final months of the Reich that American captivity meant humiliation or cruelty. But what they received instead was a metal tray, still warm from the stack, loaded with something they had never seen in such quantity: 2 heaping scoops of spaghetti, drenched in tomato sauce, topped with oversized meatballs shaped by an army cook from Texas who had learned the recipe in a mobilization training camp mess hall back in '43. For a moment, the women simply stared at it. No barking, no blows, no insults. Just food, real food, at a time when their own country could barely muster thin barley soup or a crust of coarse black bread. The oddity of the moment was captured, unintentionally, by a Signal Corps photographer whose March 1945 notes mention German women overwhelmed by the abundance of rations. His lens caught faces flushed with confusion, disbelief, and even suspicion. The field kitchen behind them was a marvel of American wartime logistics, a standardized M1937 mobile unit designed by a team of quartermaster engineers led by Captain Roland H. Ketchum, capable of feeding 100 men an hour and powered by gasoline burners that roared steadily beneath welded steel frames. None of the POWs could understand how such abundance was even possible here, on the edge of a collapsing front only days after the Ludendorff Bridge had fallen to American hands. Outside the camp perimeter, engineers of the 9th Armored Division were still repairing shell-torn roads with bulldozers and Bailey Bridge segments. Inside, the POWs whispered anxiously among themselves. Many of these women had served as radio clerks, medics, and anti-aircraft auxiliaries. They had spent months under constant air raids, sleepless nights, ration reductions, and fear that the world was ending. The Reich's propaganda machine had warned them that American soldiers were brutal, undisciplined, and eager for revenge. And yet, the soldiers in front of them seemed more concerned with maintaining order, filling canteens, and keeping the food line moving. An older woman with a bandaged wrist hesitated as an MP motioned her forward. She expected a shove. Instead, he cleared a space on a bench and set down a steaming cup of coffee beside her tray. According to an Army medic's April 1945 field observation, such scenes were common as the push across the Rhine accelerated. American units were told to stabilize every captured group quickly, both for humanitarian reasons and to prevent disease outbreaks. But to the women experiencing it, it felt surreal, almost disorienting. They glanced at one another as if afraid they were being tricked. One prisoner muttered, a dramatized composite. If this is captivity, what was the last year of our lives? Yet the reason behind these generous meals was rooted in cold operational logic as much as compassion. The U.S. Army supply chain, designed by logisticians trained at Quartermaster School in Virginia, was running at full power. With Allied control of the skies, convoys moved freely. Trains brought canned tomatoes, flour, meat, and pasta across France and Belgium. And behind it all stood an industrial engine unmatched in the war. Factories in Chicago, Detroit, and New York that had spent years perfecting mass production methods first used in the automotive boom. In 1945, the United States could feed millions of soldiers and hundreds of thousands of POWs without breaking stride. The German women didn't know these numbers, but they could feel their implications on the plate in front of them. Even the smells drifting from the cooked tents told a deeper story. The tomato sauce, simmering with garlic powder and dehydrated onions, came from ingredients standardized by the Subsistence Research Laboratory in Chicago, whose wartime reports praised the resilience of canned produce under harsh field conditions. The meatballs were a mix of beef and breadcrumbs supplied by Chicago packing plants that had increased their output by nearly 250% since 1941. To the German POWs, accustomed to meals shrinking each month since late 44, the portion sizes seemed absurd, almost mocking in their abundance. Some tried eating slowly, unsure whether they were allowed to finish. Others devoured the meal instantly, as if fearing it would be taken away. American cooks watched with a sense of grim satisfaction. Many had landed in Normandy, fought through the Hurtgen forest, or marched through the Belgian snow, and feeding prisoners felt like a strange but welcome signal that the war's brutality might finally be fading. One corporal explained in an after-action kitchen report from March 1945 that morale rose noticeably among the cooking crews whenever they served meals to POWs, because it made the war feel closer to ending. Still, beneath this moment of relative calm, the larger conflict raged on. Hitler's armies were fracturing. Allied divisions were converging on the heart of Germany. The battle for the Ruhr was only days away, promising devastation on a scale few had yet witnessed. And every prisoner that entered these camps carried stories of collapsing units, desperate officers, and chaotic retreats. But today, inside this tent city near Remagen, the shock was not from artillery or air raids. It came from a tray of food so ordinary to American soldiers that they barely noticed it, but so extraordinary to the German women that many could not speak as the morning fog lifted and sunlight struck the Rhine. An MP captain observed the line, noting how disbelief softened into exhaustion and then into something like acceptance. But little did the POWs know that the true scale of American logistical power, the real force behind these unexpected meals, was far greater than anything they had yet seen. And in the weeks ahead, its impact would reshape not just their captivity, but the entire final phase of the war. The secret behind these overwhelming portions was only beginning to reveal itself. And the truth waiting on the other side of the Rhine would astonish them even more. The true reason behind the overwhelming portions served to the German women did not lie in generosity alone. It lay in a hidden advantage the Axis had consistently underestimated: the United States' unmatched mastery of wartime logistics. By the spring of 1945, the American military's supply machinery, designed by thousands of engineers, factory planners, railroad experts, and quartermaster officers, had produced a level of abundance so vast, so relentless, that even frontline divisions drowning in mud and fire rarely went hungry. And to prisoners who had lived through the starvation winter of 44 to 45, the scale of it felt impossible. But behind that impossibility was an industrial empire firing at full strength. The Germans had entered the war convinced that discipline and fighting spirit could outmatch material might. Their commanders, trained under doctrines emphasizing speed, willpower, and maneuver, had always believed the Allies lacked staying power. And for years, propaganda reinforced it. America was supposedly decadent, disorganized, and incapable of sustained warfare. But these illusions shattered when the POWs confronted the mobile kitchens rolling across the Rhine. Within each of those kitchens lay the culmination of years of engineering by Quartermaster Corps innovators such as Lieutenant Colonel Charles E. Stafford, whose procurement directives standardized everything from the gauges of steel pots to the ignition valves on the gasoline burners. Such details were invisible to the POWs, but the results were not. The mobile kitchen at Remagen alone could produce over 350 pounds of pasta per hour. According to a March 1945 operations worksheet filed by the 111th Quartermaster Company, the machine's stainless steel boilers, produced by the Cleveland Range Company, could heat water to 212 degrees Fahrenheit even in freezing rain, thanks to double-walled insulation designed by industrial engineer Walter Newell. Its burners drew fuel from jerrycans delivered by truck convoys that stretched for miles. And to American logisticians, this was routine. To the German women, it was staggering. But nowhere was the contrast sharper than at the temporary POW camp outside Andernach. where a decisive encounter revealed the full power of America's supply chain in action. On April 5, 1945, just after dawn, trucks thundered into the camp carrying supplies for the incoming waves of prisoners, men and women captured in the Moselle Pocket. The ground was still damp from overnight rain, and MPs hurried to position barbed wire lanes for sorting. Amid this chaos, American cooks set up 3M 1937 field ranges side by side. According to a Signal Corps processing log from that morning, the order called for feeding more than 2,000 prisoners before noon. The German women marched in under guard, many expecting interrogation or punishment. Instead, they saw American cooks shoveling pasta from crates stamped Chicago, Quartermaster Depot, each box weighing 24 pounds and packed with dehydrated tomato powder engineered at the Subsistence Research Laboratory. A corporal from the 95th Infantry Division recalled in his after-action note how the POWs stared as the cooks poured full gallons of tomato concentrate into boiling water. They were frozen in disbelief. He wrote in a matter-of-fact tone that masked the surrealism of the scene. This moment of shock deepened as the sounds of preparation filled the air. Gasoline burners roared, ladles clanged against metal trays, and trucks rumbled in and out with mechanical precision. On the German side of the fence, disbelief turned into hushed anxiety. A few whispered among themselves, one muttering a dramatized composite. If this is how they feed prisoners, how do they feed their own men? Another shook her head, unable to understand how the Americans produced such quantities during an active campaign. What unfolded next became a minor legend among the cooks. As the women reached the front of the line, an MP captain gestured for them to hold out their trays. The portions were immense. A standard serving weighed about 1.5 pounds, far exceeding the 600-calorie portions the Germans had subsisted on during the final months of the war. One prisoner asked in hesitant English whether she was allowed to take all of it. An American cook nodded and even added a second scoop. The disbelief that flashed across her face was later noted in the captain's patrol log, which described the reaction as equal parts shock and fear. But this abundance was no accident. It emerged from a supply chain built on redundancy, capacity, and brute industrial power. Every field kitchen relied on food transported through a vast web of logistical arteries. Trucks built in Detroit, canned goods processed in Iowa, flour milled in Kansas, spices sourced by the Quartermaster's Technical Committee, and meat produced by packing plants operating at wartime maximum output. Engineers at the Chicago Quartermaster Depot worked tirelessly to improve container durability, ensuring that tomato paste arrived intact even after bouncing across hundreds of miles of war-torn roads. None of this made headlines, but every part of it shaped the scene unfolding before the POWs. The Andernack operation reached its peak around mid-morning. A brief drizzle fell, turning the walkways into thin mud. Yet the field kitchens continued without interruption. American cooks, following the kitchen manuals drafted at Fort Lee, synchronized their efforts like a factory line. As meatballs simmered in vats, the smell drifted across the camp and mixed with the damp air. Even the weather seemed unable to diminish the sensory impact on the German side. Confusion gave way to a strange, unsettled silence. These women, many trained in military auxiliary roles, had heard of the American Materialschlacht, a war of material, but had never imagined its human scale. In their own camps, shortages ruled everything. German field kitchens often operated with cracked boilers and insufficient fuel. Ersatz ingredients, dried turnips, acorn flour, became staples. And now, here they stood before trays overflowing with pasta and meat, prepared as if the war were being fought on American soil rather than deep inside Germany. Some of the POWs later recalled these meals in war diaries and post-war interviews, describing them as moments of surreal contrast. A former Luftwaffe auxiliary noted in her 1950 testimony that the Americans treated food as if it were limitless, a resource drawn from an endless well. She had not been wrong. U.S. wartime production reached levels previously unimaginable, and its logistical experts ensured that abundance reached the very front. Yet for all this industrial might, a deeper shock awaited the prisoners, one tied not merely to food, but to the philosophy driving the American war machine. And this revelation, building quietly beneath the surface of every steaming tray, and every generous portion would reshape their understanding of captivity, victory, and the world emerging from the destruction of 1945. What the German women encountered next would show them that the true American advantage ran far beyond calories or equipment, and its consequences would echo long after the last meatball had been served. The shock those German women felt in front of the American field kitchens was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, the deeper power behind those oversized trays of spaghetti and meatballs became impossible for them to ignore. It was not simply that the Americans could cook more food or that their kitchens operated with assembly line precision. It was the revelation that this abundance was woven into every corner of the U.S. war effort, from the battlefield to the factories, from the engineers drafting blueprints to the railroad workers driving supply trains through the night. It signaled a strategic and psychological advantage far greater than any weapon. Even after the fighting had ended along the Rhine, American logistics continued to operate at wartime tempo. Engineers at the Philadelphia Quartermaster Depot kept sending improved burner valves and insulated containers to units in Germany, ensuring that even temporary camps like Andernach could sustain thousands of POWs without strain. This consistency had a profound psychological effect. German interrogators who cooperated with U.S. forces after the war noted in their evaluations that prisoners were repeatedly unsettled by the Americans' ability to provide in days what Germany could not produce in months. The disparity wasn't lost on the women behind the wire either. Many had served in signals units, transport detachments, or administrative branches, and they recognized that such efficiency could not be improvised. It had to be built. For the Americans, it had been built long before D-Day. Planning committees in Washington, drawing on research from industrial analysts, agricultural scientists, and transportation engineers, had designed a wartime economy capable of sustaining multiple global fronts. These planners included men like Brigadier General Edmund B. Gregory, whose quartermaster oversight emphasized redundancy and resilience, and Dr. Carl Fellers of the Subsistence Research Laboratory, whose breakthroughs in canning stability ensured that meat products could survive the transatlantic journey and still taste fresh. Their decisions echoed directly into the hands of the cooks serving prisoners in 1945 that the German women sensed this order even in the smallest details. When an American cook replaced a warped ladle with a spare pulled straight from a crate, the action seemed insignificant. But in their eyes, it indicated a system where nothing depended on luck. When MPs received fresh gloves within days of theirs wearing thin, the contrast with German shortages felt almost surreal. These impressions were noted in post-war psychological summaries compiled by Allied occupation authorities, which observed that many POWs interpreted logistical abundance as a sign of national strength and inevitability. Andernach became a quiet microcosm of this transformation. Though the camp lasted only weeks, the women experienced firsthand how America's logistical power didn't fade with victory, it intensified. As more camps consolidated and repatriation schedules formed, U.S. supply officers maintained food output even as demands fluctuated daily. Trains from Antwerp and Le Havre delivered crates of pasta, canned vegetables, flour, and meat, all tracked by IBM punch card systems that civilian engineers had adapted for military use. This computational precision was something Germany had never achieved in wartime. Its record-keeping was often meticulous, but its ability to implement changes was crippled by shortages, fuel scarcity, and Allied bombing. The POWs, sensing this structural difference, began asking quiet questions among themselves. How had the Americans sustained such abundance while fighting on continents far from home? How had their soldiers managed to eat well in places where the civilians were starving? And how had their kitchens remained so consistent while the German supply network had crumbled long before the final collapse? The answers filtered in slowly through rumors, guards' conversations, and the reports occasionally read aloud to prisoners. America's vast farmland, its industrial capacity, and its engineers who solved logistical problems before they appeared. But logistics were only one part of the psychological landscape. There was also the matter of treatment. Many of the German women, especially those who had served near the front, expected humiliation or retaliation. Instead, they encountered a rigid but measured discipline. American MPs followed procedures drafted by judge advocate officers and informed by Geneva Convention guidelines. A Signal Corps report from May 1945 mentions that troops were repeatedly reminded that fair treatment aided post-war stability, a principle drilled into U.S. units throughout the European theater. For the women who had grown up under a regime that celebrated brutality as strength, this professionalism carried its own kind of weight. None of this erased the hardships of captivity. The camps were crowded. Sanitation could falter. Tensions simmered between prisoners who had been ardent loyalists and those who were simply exhausted by the war. Yet, even amid these struggles, the women documented their astonishment at the consistency of American food distribution. Diaries recovered years later, some preserved by German archivists, described meals as symbols of an alien order, one where abundance replaced scarcity and procedure replaced improvisation. To them, this order was both comforting and unsettling. Over time, the experience contributed to a wider realization that echoed across occupied Germany. The war had not been lost merely on the battlefield. It had been lost in the factories, the shipping yards, the research labs, and the logistical corridors where America's strength had accumulated piece by piece. American troops could rely on a fresh uniform, a hot meal, or spare parts for their vehicles. German troops, by late 1944, could rely on almost nothing. The women in camps like Andernach saw that disparity not as an abstract military fact, but as a daily, physical reality on their plates. This revelation would influence the German psyche long after the prisoners returned home. In the early years of rebuilding, when U.S. food shipments under the Marshall Plan flowed into devastated towns, many recalled their POW days as the first glimpse of the scale of American capacity. And for a generation growing up in ruins, the memory of those meals, simple, heavy portions meant to sustain, bodies worn down by war, became tied to the idea of stability itself. Historians later noted that such encounters helped shape post-war German attitudes toward the West. Food became a symbol of more than sustenance. It represented systems, values, and the future. The women who once stared in shock at the size of an American serving spoon became witnesses to the industrial philosophy that would soon rebuild Europe. As the last POW trains departed, the camps and the kitchens finally shut down. One American captain reportedly remarked, in a line later preserved in an oral history project, dramatized, "Wars aren't won by the men who fire the guns. They're won by the people who make sure those men can eat." It was a sentiment shaped by experience, one the German prisoners came to understand in their own way. And beneath the fading steam of those field kitchens, a quiet truth settled across the battered landscape. Abundance had been a weapon too, one as decisive as any tank or rifle, and its legacy would endure long after the final plates of spaghetti and meatballs had been served. ***. Like, share, and subscribe for more World War II stories.